You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Half a million people take ecstasy every week in the UK, and for the first time ever, a British broadcaster televised a medical study into the effects that clinical-grade MDMA, also known as ecstasy, has on the brain. The trial, which operated under a Home Office licence, was funded by Channel 4 and led by Professor Val Curran of University College London and Professor David Nutt from Imperial College. To discuss the drugs trial, the implications of it being broadcast on television and what further studies may be carried out is joint lead of the trial, Professor Val Curran, consultant addiction psychiatrist and study doctor on the Drugs Live MDMA project, Tim Williams, Professor Derek Moore, Director for the Institute for Research in Child Development from the University of East London, and David Raynes, a drugs prevention campaigner from the National Drug Prevention Alliance. We're also joined by Sam Wisely, not his real name, who admits to using MDMA on a regular basis. Firstly, I'm going to start with you, Val. Can you explain the ecstasy trial to us?
The ecstasy trial was run as a proper scientific trial. What we were wanting to do was to see what effects this drug had on the human brain and how those effects produced the unique aspects of MDMA, so things like empathy, energy, euphoria.
And why would you have chosen a television show to present the trial and its findings?
Well, the television show was secondary to the actual scientific aims, but Channel 4 funded the entire trial, and we were very keen that, as part of our remit as academics, that we engage in public education. And it was quite a kind of unique opportunity, really, to share the science of how you actually investigate a drug like this with a television audience.
Why hasn't ecstasy ever been investigated like this before?
Well, it's an interesting question, actually, because obviously ecstasy has been around and been taken for more than 30 years in Europe and other parts of the world. And there have been very, very few studies where a controlled dose was actually given to a human being. There's lots of animal research, obviously, but very little research in humans. And part of the reason for this is that, some people have very strong views that illicit drugs or illegal drugs should not be given to people. They should not be studied, which we find really strange because, there are drugs like morphine, for example, that are really important medicines that we use for pain control and anesthesia, lots of indications. And yet diamorphine, a very related product, is heroin around in the streets. So there are quite a lot of medicines that are also street drugs of abuse. And, for us, it didn't seem such a big deal to investigate potential medical uses of MDMA, whilst also acknowledging that it's a street drug of abuse.
Tim Williams, you were a study doctor on the Drugs Live project. How long overdue is this?
It's essential research, really. Ecstasy has been used by millions of people, and millions of doses in the UK are used every year, but we know comparatively little about it. And a lot of the studies out there already, it's very difficult to capture the pure effects of ecstasy on a person. Because ecstasy tends to be used with all sorts of other drugs, which means that some of the results can be very difficult to interpret. So it was a fantastic opportunity to really hone in on ecstasy and the effects on the brain, but also the cognitive effects on its own without any other substances being taken at the same time.
David Raynes, then, a fantastic opportunity to present the drugs trial. What's your response to that?
I thought it was a thinly veiled publicity stunt for ecstasy, and whether or not there's a medical use for ecstasy in controlled and clinical conditions, I don't know, and I don't have a position on it, and I wouldn't take a position on it. I'm not a scientist. The programme was meretricious rubbish. It dealt with the scientific experiment, but overlaid on that was an awful lot of talk about social use of ecstasy as a street drug, a party drug. A lot of the audience were recruited because that was their position.
Sam, do you think a television show broadcasting the outcome of a clinical trial on ecstasy in any way would influence a current drug user or a potential drug user?
I think there's always pros and cons about this type of thing. I mean, for example, MDMA, and I've been around a lot of people that have taken this kind of drug and plenty of others, it's not very habit-forming naturally. And people always gone about this like this come-down thing or something, but that's actually just the depletion of serotonin. But as long as you actually take some potassium and some vitamin C and some good sleep and a bit of food and some water, then you can easily, as long as you don't take it too often, so it's kind of naturally quite a recreational thing. It's with all things, there's always recreation and moderation.
Professor Derek Moore, you're somewhat critical of the trial that was conducted last night.
I'm not sure where I stand in terms of the actual trial, because one of the issues about any sort of scientific research is that really you can't really evaluate it until you've seen it published or you've seen the data and the methodology. But what I'm kind of interested in is the sense of risk. And what we're talking about, a lot of the discussion is about the risks for the individual who takes the drug. So obviously, if an individual, whether or not that affects their brain chemistry and their memory and so on. From my perspective as a child psychologist, what I'm interested in is about the risks for unborn children, and there are lots of potential risk factors in terms of pregnancy. And ecstasy is one that has not really been known about until very recently. We've just done a study which has just been published in Pediatrics, where we looked at women who'd taken ecstasy during pregnancy and other drugs as well. So they were polydrug users, and we looked at them in comparison to other polydrug users, and there was a significant and a clinically significant effect on their motor functioning, so their ability to control their movements at 4 months and 6 months. So, and the point about that is that these were women who were taking the drug probably before they even knew they were pregnant. So it's not a case of just telling people not to take drugs during pregnancy. There will be a lot of women who will be taking drugs this weekend, who will get pregnant, will not know they're pregnant, may already be pregnant. And the question for me is really, when there's a discussion about risk, we kind of need to broaden that to think about the risks not just for the individual, but for the unborn child and also for parenting. I mean, there's issues about what the drug does in terms of oxytocin, in terms of the way in which it makes bonding with the child. I mean, that hasn't been looked at yet. So that's my perspective, really.
Go on, Val.
I completely appreciate that perspective. But any doctor would say that a woman would be advised not to take any kind of drug, even in the first trimester when they might possibly be going to get pregnant. So ecstasy, yes, of course, I agree, but also alcohol. If you put MDMA in the context of so-called legal drugs like alcohol, we have in this country about 20 deaths a year from ecstasy. We have 20 deaths a month from acute alcohol poisoning that killed Amy Winehouse, for example, and 8,000 deaths a year in the UK from chronic alcohol abuse. Your brain doesn't know the difference between a legal drug and an illegal drug. It will treat them all the same. Alcohol is a very dirty drug acting on many, many brain chemicals. Ecstasy is a much cleaner drug that we understand. We're not recommending anyone use ecstasy. What the trial was about was seeing whether early evidence from America that ecstasy might be useful when taken in clinical doses under supervision with a therapist 2 or 3 times might help people with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is completely separate from kids out there taking ecstasy in clubs, dancing a lot, not sleeping, and often mixing with other drugs.
Tim, then, just wondered if you could refer back to what Sam said in terms of the addiction associated with MDMA. He suggested it wasn't particularly an addictive drug. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think there's some elements of truth in that. I mean, what we see with MDMA is that there's a very high tolerance, and then that naturally suppresses its addictive potential. So what I mean by that is that if someone took an ecstasy tablet on one night, they would probably have to take 2 tablets the next night and maybe 4 tablets the night after to get a similar effect. and obviously it becomes a decreasing reward. So there's a natural break on ecstasy or MDMA in terms of a reinforcer in that way. So it seems that there are some reinforcing patterns with all drugs, like ecstasy, but it's much less. I mean, whenever we're giving advice, we always need to be proportionate. We always need to try and advise young people. If we don't get the message as right and correct as we can, then people will switch off because they know the reality of what's going on out there. So if we say, ecstasy is, a Class A drug and it's as dangerous as crack cocaine and heroin, people aren't going to listen to that because it's just not true. Well, it's true that it's a Class A drug, but it's certainly not as dangerous as crack cocaine and heroin. So we need to be proportionate about the risks associated with ecstasy. Otherwise, the people we're giving advice to will not listen to us.
Okay, Professor Derek Moore.
Yeah, can I just come in there about in terms of the risks? I mean, I don't think we can say yet what the risks are in terms of prenatal development. I mean, I appreciate what people are saying about the effects for the individual, but I come back to that point, which is about, it's a sort of general public health point. Is that if you're saying that it's okay that ecstasy is a relatively undamaging drug for the individual, what happens is that message then gets confused with that it's relatively okay in terms of prenatal development. And I think we just have to be careful, and that's really what I would say. I mean, a program like last night and previous night, if we're talking about public understanding, we have to make sure that public understanding is across the broad range of it in terms of risk. And that I still think that's not necessarily the message that's getting through.
I think there's the message, though, that Tim says, that, you present something in a way that people can digest it. And I think the programme last night certainly does serve that purpose. You then, David Raynes, are you anti the programme, anti the trial, or just anti-drugs?
I'm anti the programme. The trial is a scientific trial is a scientific trial, and we know how they're done, and they're usually kept behind closed doors, and they're usually analysed properly, as Derek said. I find it extraordinary that Professor Curran keeps lapsing into, and she did it last night on the programme, into this comparison with alcohol and tobacco. Those are the two drugs that we all have in our societies. The real reason alcohol causes as much damage as it does is strictly because of prevalence. The next most damaging drug in our society after alcohol and tobacco is actually cannabis. It's not crack cocaine or heroin. Cannabis causes enormous damage, and again, it's because of prevalence. And so the people who argue for legalisation, and there were a lot of them at the programme, and Professor Curran keeps slipping into it, Professor Nutt does it regularly, they're arguing for the legalisation of more drugs that will cause social and personal damage. I don't just see the argument.
I'm sorry, that is complete rubbish. Neither myself nor David Nutt have ever argued for legalisation. The programme has nothing to do with that. It was to do with potential medical uses. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a very difficult disorder to treat. And 1 in 3 people with clinical depression don't respond to the available antidepressants or to psychological therapies like cognitive behavioural therapy. So there's an enormous need for alternative treatments, and all we're doing as scientists, we're not pro-drugs or anti-drugs or anything, we're just trying to find out if this stuff could actually help.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, where we're discussing televising drug trials and exploring the effects of MDMA. I'm joined by consultant addiction psychiatrist Tim Williams, Professor Derek Moore, Director for the Institute for Research in Child Development, David Raynes, a drug preventions campaigner, Sam Wisely, not his real name, a drug user, and Professor Val Curran from University College London. Can you explain to us a little more about the role of the euphoric high that people get from taking MDMA and how that could perhaps help someone like a returning soldier from Afghanistan who's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yeah, I mean, the euphoria is one thing. That's a high that people can experience from lots of different drugs, including alcohol. What we were trying to say in the programme was to look at what psychological mechanisms, the effects of this drug, might be helpful in therapy. And in the programme, we showed new data whereby when people were given ecstasy and shown faces of people, they were asked to invest up to £500 in each of those faces. They could invest nothing, £500 or £200. It's a bit like a program called The Dragon's Den, and it's a way psychologists use to measure trust between people. And what we found was that a single dose of 83 milligrams of MDMA significantly increased trust in people on the day, the first time that people came to the trial. When they came again a week later, so those people given MDMA on the first day, when they were given placebo, so an inactive compound, the week later, their trust ratings went hugely up. They gave 8 times as much money to the faces as before. Now, this is a very powerful effect that no other drug that I know of can do. If you put that into a therapeutic situation with a patient and a psychological therapist, if you can enhance trust that way, then therapy is going to work so much better. And for all these people whose lives have been seriously disrupted with post-traumatic stress disorder or treatment-resistant depression, it could be a huge breakthrough. And if we can improve people's quality of life and experience, surely that's a very important aim for medical research.
Professor Derek Moore.
Yeah, I mean, I said at the beginning, I don't have any particular problem with the trial. I mean, I don't think I can evaluate it yet. I mean, you know, the usual process for scientific discovery is people do a study, and then they publish it and or they submit it for publication, and then the reviewers look at it and discuss it through the review process. And I mean, one of the difficulties with something like this is that you know, kind of we find ourselves in the middle of the trial in a sense, seeing it as it's happening, which isn't really what happened. So, I mean, from the scientific point of view, it's actually very difficult for scientists to be able to comment on this because we haven't seen the data, we haven't seen the methods that have been used, we haven't seen the detailed scans. I mean, I mean, maybe they've been put somewhere. I haven't seen them, you know, myself. So I mean, it would actually be remiss of me to kind of comment on that. But I mean, my issue really is just about the way in which it, you know, I mean, I appreciate what Val's saying, and I mean, it's a perfectly admirable thing to want to do is to explore this. The difficulties is that mixing it up with the kind of TV media. I mean, I hesitate to use the word circus, but it kind of came over a little bit like that. And you know, I was keen to be involved in it and to be able to say something about some of the effects as well. I mean, I mean, I just think what happened was it seemed to get a momentum of its own, and it seemed to be sort of going into very much the positives of the experience of taking ecstasy, which are obviously positive. I mean, that isn't disputable. A lot of drugs give you a positive effect. That's why they're taken. But in a sense, it's if you just focus on that, you run the risk of not actually sort of going into some of the more detail. And you know, you had a few minutes of the counter arguments.
That's exactly my point. I mean, I said it was a thinly veiled publicity stunt for ecstasy, and I still feel that. I think that the mixing up of the science and laudable. The science may be laudable. Post-traumatic stress is a very difficult thing to deal with, and it may be a part solution. I'm not qualified to say. But the programme last night was rubbish. It was rubbish. I would call it a circus, Derek. I mean, I think it was absolutely taken. It was taken from the science at the beginning of the programme, and the second programme, and it was taken into street use and party use in Glastonbury. That's just, I mean, they just want viewers.
Tim Williams, you mentioned earlier that you thought that providing a scientific study and showing it to people who need to see it is a positive thing. What's your reaction then to what you've just heard and the fact that it's being accused as a circus?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's an argument for the TV producers, who I thought did a quite a good job at balancing the various demands that they need to get across. I think it's our responsibility as scientists to get a message across, and part of winning grants these days is you have to show how you're going to publicise the results of your trial, and we have to engage with the media these days to get across our message. It's really important to improve education and knowledge. I mean, I think to call it a circus is rather strong. I don't think anyone, any of the experts on the panel, were promoting ecstasy or drug taking in any way. I think that's he's going a bit far there.
I think this really highlights the sort of 21st century window on actually how science does need to be presented to the public. And I know you did mention earlier, Professor Moore, about the review process and it not going through the channels that would you'd usually see it through. Therefore, as scientists, you probably haven't had the chance to see it. But we're changing. It's, everything is moving online now. Everything is moving digitally. Some publishers publish just solely online now, and they publish online first. It's not surprising then that we've seen a drugs trial televised. Val?
Well, I agree with Derek Moore that, our normal way of doing things as scientists traditionally has been to, send off a paper to a journal and get it published. And that's exactly what's going to happen with all the data from this trial. But it was kind of unusual because it's not that easy to get funding for work with drugs that are Class A illegal drugs. And so this was a kind of unique experiment. It's certainly the first time I've ever heard of any study like this in the world being funded by a television company. So there were things that we did, as Tim has said about, having to show the impact of our research. Because it was funded by Channel 4, it did change things a bit. But on the other hand, there were 2.3 million viewers on the first night. And the majority were in the 18 to 25-year-old bracket. Now, that is a huge impact because not many of those 18 to 25-year-olds would read the articles that Tim or I might publish in medical or psychological journals. And these, in a way, are the audience that actually we want to influence and to give them a balanced view. We were not promoting drugs in any way. We were promoting a balance. And Channel 4 rolled on two people who are renownedly anti-ecstasy.
Professor Moore.
I suppose I just want to say, I think Val absolutely right. I mean, it's important for scientists to disseminate information about what we do, and this is a great opportunity to do that and a huge audience to do it to. I suppose my worry is that if it only focused on one piece of data, that's not really what you would do as a scientist. You would say, well, look, here's a review of all the data, here's a review of all the studies that are available, not just focus on the one that you've done. I mean, I can understand it because obviously it was funded by Channel 4, so that's inevitably going to be what happens. But I suppose, to then give 3 minutes, obviously, to Andy Parrott, who has his own strong opinions and his own particular perspective, did actually create a false, almost a false sort of, hostility kind of dynamic, which actually it could have been avoided in a sense by just broadening it out a bit, allowing a little bit of time for other people to talk, which actually was not available.
Without dissecting the programme, because I think that is certainly a reason why we're all here, but actually I don't think the wider issue as to why we're all here, and obviously the discussion and the debate reaching people that you probably wouldn't do before, it does open up the discussion on whether ecstasy is safe or not. What do you think, David Raynes, and what sort of legacy do you think this drugs trial will have on society?
I think it's just part of normalising drug-taking behaviour. I mean, Andy Parrott is Professor Andy Parrott. Perhaps we should tell listeners that. And he is probably the UK expert on MDMA. He said it's unsuitable for human consumption. He's one of the two probably best-known world experts. He got a couple of minutes. And in the programme, without dissecting the programme, Professor Curran was justifying the use of ecstasy, and I felt very uncomfortable with that because it took it away from the science.
Val?
That's complete rubbish. I was not justifying the use of ecstasy. I was talking as a psychopharmacologist doing a proper double-blind trial of a moderate dose of this drug. So I don't know what programme you actually saw last night, but it wasn't a message that either myself or Dave Nutt would ever put out. But can I come back to your question, is ecstasy safe or not? I think what we tried to put across in the programme is that A, we wouldn't recommend anyone take drugs, and B, if you want to take a drug, let's put over harm reduction messages. So if you definitely decide to take ecstasy, take a small part of a pill, wait for 2 hours, see what the effects are. Don't go near it if you've got any heart condition. If you're at a party or in a club and you start to get hot, go outside, cool down. And if you feel thirsty, be really, really moderate about taking small sips. It's harm reduction. The safety or not of ecstasy depends on how it's taken and under what circumstances. We showed how, the hypothalamus was affected by ecstasy, and so your control of your body temperature and your thirst is out of kilter.
David, you were going to make a point then.
Well, a lot of the stuff that's out there actually isn't ecstasy, and we heard some scientific reports last night, didn't we? A lot of the stuff that says it's ecstasy isn't, and so a lot of it's got some other chemicals in. I would say to young people, don't take anything.
Tim, what legacy do you hope then this drugs trial will leave on society?
Yeah, I hope it raises the awareness. I hope it encourages a generation of people to question themselves and have that scientific inquisitiveness. And I'm an addiction psychiatrist. You know, this is an incredibly prevalent drug, MDMA, and and heroin, for example, is a much less prevalent drug. But my clinics, the people I see, are full of people with problems with heroin and crack cocaine and alcohol. Whilst ecstasy is not safe, we need to give harm minimization. I think a very good harm minimization advice is making people aware that what's in a pill may not be ecstasy. I think that's a fantastic point. But fundamentally, we need to get the right information out there. Misinformation kills people. I mean, if you look back to the 90s when people said you've got to drink lots of water, that's actually killed people from water intoxication. So we need to get the right information out. We need to engage with young people. It's not good enough to be sat at the back and not getting our message across. So hopefully we can start to make changes.
This is the Voice of Russia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, where we're discussing the televising of drug trials. Joining me around the table is Professor Val Curran from University College London, David Raynes, a drugs prevention campaigner, Professor Derek Moore, Director for the Institute for Research in Child Development, and on the telephone, consultant addiction psychiatrist Tim Williams, and drug user Sam Wisely, which isn't his real name. Sam, I'd like to hear from you now. Do you think this sort of drugs trial has engaged with the people who take drugs, or the harm minimisation messages are useful for people who regularly take drugs?
It was interesting because most of us wanted to watch it to see how the media would actually portray the drug. And of course, because it was Channel 4, they had to make it entertainment, which is the reason as to why you have this interesting spin on things. Now, I don't think the intention was to have that entertainment aspect to it, but that's how it has to be if it's on television. That's why you should go on TED.com or something and do something on there. It's a little bit less Channel 4-y, but on the mainstream media, it's great that it's coming out. That's the best thing about it. And for the health implications or benefit, people are going to do it anyway as a party drug. There's no point legalising it yet, because the simple fact is people are going to do it anyway.
Professor Moore, would you consider, with your research then, maybe presenting it in this format on television?
I think, well, my experience would be I would, but I think I'd have to have some editorial control.
Final word from you then, Val.
There's been a lot of work on the long-term effects, and most of it's now showing in terms of the brain that it's completely reversible a year after people stop taking the drug. I think the results of our trial were encouraging, and we really hope that Dave Nutt now goes on and carries out the first UK trial with people with post-traumatic stress disorder.
I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me to discuss televising drug trials and exploring the effects of ecstasy. Thank you to consultant addiction psychiatrist Tim Williams, Professor Derek Moore, the Director for the Institute for Research in Child Development, David Raynes, a drugs prevention campaigner, Sam Wisely, a user and dealer and not his real name, and Professor Val Curran from the University College London.